Welcome to Classical Poetry as Music. Our mission is to introduce our audience to classical poetry forms through contemporary music. Stay tuned for entertainment and enlightenment.
This podcast is brought to you by Schaefer Media Enterprises. Please visit classicalpoetryrules.com for more information and to support this project.
In this, our inaugural episode, we'll be covering the undisputed king of the heroic couplet, Alexander Pope. Born in 1688, Alexander Pope was an English poet renowned for his mastery of the heroic couplet and his sharp satirical wit. Born in London to a Catholic family during a time of religious tension, Pope faced both legal restrictions and health challenges, including Pott's disease, which stunted his growth and left him frail. Despite these obstacles, he rose to literary prominence with works like An Essay on Criticism, 1711, which showcased his precocious talent at age 23, and The Rape of the Lock, 1714, a mock epic that cemented his reputation for blending humor with social commentary. His translation of Homer's Iliad brought financial independence, rare for a writer then, while An Essay on Man, 1734, distilled his philosophical optimism into memorable lines like "Hope springs eternal." A key figure in the Augustan age, Pope's polished verse and biting critiques of his contemporaries left a lasting mark on English literature, though his prickly personality earned him as many enemies as admirers. An Essay on Criticism, written by Alexander Pope in 1709 and published in 1711, is a poetic treatise in heroic couplets that explores the principles of literary criticism and the qualities of a good critic, reflecting the neoclassical ideals of the early 18th century. Spanning over 700 lines, it's divided into three parts. The first lays out general rules for criticism rooted in nature and reason, urging critics to balance wit with judgment. The second critiques common flaws like pride, ignorance, and envy that lead to bad criticism. And the third offers a historical survey of great critics like Aristotle, Horace, and Dryden as models of excellence. Pope, just 21 when he wrote it, flexes his mastery of form with an AABB rhyme scheme in iambic pentameter, delivering famous lines like, "A little learning is a dangerous thing," and "To err is human, to forgive divine," making it both a practical guide and a showcase of his razor-sharp style. It's a young poet's bold stab at defining taste and intellect, still studied for its wit and insight into art's rules and limits. Here is an excerpt from the poem.
Such shameless bard we have, and yet 'tis true, they're as mad abandoned critics too. The bookful blockhead ignorantly read, with loads of learned lumber in his head, with his own tongue still edifies his ears, and always listening to himself appears. Name a new play, and he's a poet's friend. Nay, showed his faults, but when would poets mend? No place so sacred from such fops as Bard, nor is Paul's church more safe than Paul's churchyard. Nay, fly to altars, there they'll talk you dead, for fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Distrustful sense with modest caution speaks. It still looks home and short excursions makes, but rattling nonsense in full volleys breaks, and never shocked and never turned aside, bursts out resistless with thundering tide.
Okay, so I hear many of you asking, what was that about? Perhaps surprisingly, the poem might actually make more sense if you listen to it as a song. Here's the song, Angels Fear to Tread, based on that section of An Essay on Criticism. We'll reconvene after the song.
Such shameless bards we have, and yet 'tis true, there are as mad abandoned critics too. The bookful blockhead ignorantly read, with loads of learned lumber in his head. With his own tongue still edifies his ears, and always listening to himself appears. Name a new play, and he's the poet's friend. Nay, showed his faults, but when would poets mend? So sacred from caution speaks. It still looks home and short excursions makes, but rattling nonsense in full volleys breaks. And never shocked and never turned aside, bursts out resistless with a thundering tide. With modest caution speaks. It still looks home and short excursions makes, but rattling nonsense in full volleys breaks. And never shocked and never turned aside, bursts out resistless with a thundering tide. Distrustful sense with modest caution speaks. It still looks home and short excursions makes, with loads of lumber in his hutch and speaks. It still looks home and short excursions makes, but rattling nonsense in full volleys breaks. And never shocked and never turned aside, bursts out resistless with a thundering tide. 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 The book for blockhead ignorantly read, with loads of learned lumber in his head. With his own tongue still edifies his ears, and always listening to himself appears.
This section of the poem and the song are about, quote, bookful blockheads, critics who can quote tons of stuff but can't produce any of it. There's an old saying that everybody's a critic, meaning that it's easy to criticize, but not so easy to create. Pope is talking about how you aren't safe from these, quote, fops, whether in a church or even at a funeral. These critics are going so far beyond their expertise that they're treading where even angels would fear to tread, and yet they don't hesitate to burst out with their opinions. I think it's safe to say that now, 300 years later, we all still know people like this. This is why Pope's poetry is timeless. I hope that this short introduction has caught your interest and that you'll like, share, and follow this podcast and join us for more episodes soon.
This podcast is brought to you by Schaefer Media Enterprises. That's Schaefer spelled S-H-A-F-F-E-R. Please visit classicalpoetryrules.com for more information and to support this project. That's Classical Poetry, RULES.com, because classical poetry does, in fact, rule.